The book of the week from last week that I will talk about today is System Error, Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot by Rob Reich, Mehran Sahami, and Jeremy M. Weinstein. And so this book took a look, and it comes from three different authors with three different perspectives. One is a philosopher, one is a computer scientist, and one more in policy. Looking at how we got to where we are now with big tech and the tech companies, and also some thoughts on how we can do better and how we can, as the subtitle says, how we can reboot. And so it's interesting looking at their perspectives on how we got here. It's very easy to say something is all good or all bad, and I tend to go away from those types of arguments or thoughts. So, social media is all bad, or big tech, it's all bad, or it's good and we should completely get out of their way and let them do whatever they want. Same things we hear about free speech, for example, something I might touch on. They talked about it in the book. But really the truth is more nuanced than that. It's not just that all tech is bad and all the tech companies are bad, and it's not that they're all good and we have to just get out of their way. There is much more to look at than just that. So there is an interesting argument they make early in the book, which I think is interesting, about optimization and how engineers in general, and then in tech, there's this mindset of just optimizing everything. And they even share the story of this company. I remember when it came out, probably about 10 plus years ago, I forgot exactly when it was, called Soylent, which was this young man decided that eating and food takes a lot of time. So he created this type of a drink, really, that had all the essential ingredients and nutrients that a human needs to survive and stay healthy. And you could just drink this liquid. It was kind of like a powder that you'd mix with water, and then you could drink it every day. And now you don't have to think about food. And it seemed like it optimized eating in a way. Even there was, I think, an article in the newspaper around that time called The End of Food. But then the problem was that we optimized something that didn't need to be optimized, or that people also enjoyed experiencing. And so we see this happening in a lot of things in life, where people just try to become more efficient, and we think if something is more efficient, it's good. And we look for these life hacks and shortcuts. And there are places where that can be helpful, but people often take that to an extreme. Even I see this with relationships, where there's this sense of, well, can I talk to my partner for 5 minutes and that's enough? Or can we somehow reduce the time we spend but still get the same impact? But a lot of things in life are about the process, about the experience. Some people watch TV shows at 2.5 times the speed. You might be listening to this podcast right now at 2 times the speed if you're listening to it on a podcast. But especially things like TV shows and movies, I find it interesting when people watch them fast, or faster than they are recorded or made, because it's about experiencing what the people go through. And so there's this mindset that it's about finishing a show or getting through the show, when you would think that it's more about experiencing the show, enjoying it. So if you watched 2 shows because you saw them twice as fast but you didn't really enjoy the show, what are you really doing there? And so I think that's the topic they bring up, is what is about making things efficient or optimizing things. And we have to always look at what is lost when you do that. So similar to if we take away the enjoyment of food when you create a product that's just a drink that gets you the nutrients, where else do we see this happen? And we see this happening in tech as well. So I thought that was an interesting point that's brought up, and it does bring up this overall conception of when we're creating technology, sometimes we just think progress means making things faster, coming up with something new, which of course it includes that, but we always have to look at, is it benefiting society, human beings, the human race in some way? And also, what negative effects is it having? Just because something is a new technology that didn't exist before doesn't mean that's good, and doesn't mean it has to just be unleashed on the public or unleashed on people because of that. And even they share about CRISPR technologies and gene editing and genetics, which I don't know so much about, but that some of the scientists that actually came up with it decided to put a moratorium, put a hold on working with it, because they saw the potentials for misuse and issues that could come up. And so this could be seen as, oh, we're getting in the way of progress, but progress has to be tempered with what the effects are and what they can be. Even we've seen this with nuclear weapons, where there was this arms race to create these new things, of course for power and to try to dominate the other side, but it could have led to the end of the world in a quite literal sense. It could have been the end of the human race. Several times we got to that point, and still in a way have that risk because of those weapons existing. So when we're trying to optimize something or make things more efficient or advance something, there's sometimes this mindset that if it's more efficient, if it's more powerful, if it's whatever fill in the blank is, that's always better because you're optimizing. But that's not necessarily the case. We always have to look at the human impact. And so we see that with tech, and especially with things like social media, where if the goal is just get more eyeballs on the screen, well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's good for individuals and it's good for society. And so we're seeing those negative impacts where people are spending too much time and distracting themselves online, or also affecting themselves negatively, for example, by comparing themselves with other people. We know that if people are depressed and they go to social media, they feel worse about themselves because they're having a negative experience of their own life and feeling down and low about it, and then they see the curated and edited and photoshopped versions of other people's lives and they feel worse. They say, see how good everyone has it but me. I'm the only loser here and everyone else is doing all right. So when big tech comes in and creates these products and just thinks, well, how do we become more efficient? And of course, it's also about making more profit. And this is where also my thoughts about capitalism. I talked about Thomas Piketty's book, Brief History of Equality, a couple weeks ago. That when capitalism loses sight of the effect it has on people and just thinks the market will figure everything out, that to me is a fantasy that we have, that just the markets will solve the problems or won't create their own problems. I don't think that works. And so we see the arguments in the book that these authors make involve a nuance of there has to be regulation, there has to be ways that the government and also citizens get in the way and try to understand what's going on to make changes, and of course progress has to be made as well. So we have to find some type of balance. But right now, the technologists, the people who are making the technology and the CEOs of these companies have the power, and they are not necessarily using it in the best interests of the people. So we need to shift those balances. Now, what's interesting is this book, I think, came out last year, but whenever it came out, of course, could not have known about the purchase of Twitter by Elon Musk, which just happened in the past few days. And it's hard to know exactly what impact that is going to have. My primary concern overall is that when we isolate power in the hands of a few, we end up with problems. That's what we see in tech in general, that there's just a few big players really when you look at it. Facebook, which, well, now it's Meta, but owns Instagram and WhatsApp. We have Google, which also has YouTube, and then Amazon, and then Apple's one of the other ones, and Amazon. I don't know if I mentioned, or Microsoft, but there's a few big ones, and they really have almost all the power, and that usually creates issues and problems, and they become too big to fail, and they also become too big to stop. They have so much power, and very much too big to compete to, which is something that we see. So is Twitter being in private hands of one individual? Of course, it's not that he's going to be running it from A to Z himself, but is that a good thing? Overall, I think it's not a good direction, but we shall see what happens. But it was interesting that I was reading this book and some things related to those kinds of issues of who owns and what happens comes up, and then this story was in the news of Elon Musk purchasing one of the biggest platforms that we do have. So the author suggests ways that we need to make things better. I thought it was interesting, some of the suggestions they had, including that we have to include ethics in the ways that we train our software engineers, coders, people that go into these fields. As they say we have in other fields, like the medical field, there is a code of ethics, there is a group or bodies that help enforce norms. So what I shared about that CRISPR technology, there was a Chinese biologist who did research using that and presented it, and he was really shunned and had faced lots of consequences because of that. So it was not okay what he did because he violated those norms those values, the ethics that had been created by the community. And these things will always have issues. Anytime we give power to even a group, then there will be things that happen. Just like when we try to regulate the kinds of things that people can put online, there's going to be disagreement, there will be overreach, there's going to be bias. It's going to be a challenging process, but it doesn't mean we just give up on trying to regulate things. So that's one of the things they bring up near the end of the book, is we need to have that. We also need to rein in the power of the companies, that they don't have so much sway, so the governments have to be involved in that way to regulate what's going on. So they call it checking corporate power. And they also mention that we have to empower the citizens and the institutions that we have to know more about what's going on. So reading a book like this for me gave me some of that, but that we need an informed citizenry to make decisions if something is on the ballot, to make the decisions that we think benefit us and to impact what's going on, and to not just think we have no impact on it. So we have to increase the impact that citizens can have, but of course citizens themselves have to empower themselves by knowing what's going on. And for most of us, we don't really know what's happening, and so there also is a lot of calls for more transparency that they talk about as well. So, the book was an interesting one. I don't read much on tech and those things, so I wanted to inform myself a bit more about these types of situations, and this was a great book on that, and I'd highly recommend you check it out. Again, that is System Error: Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot, by Rob Reich, Mehran Sahami, and Jeremy M. Weinstein. Let's go to a commercial break. Studio number 310-441-0555. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So, talked about the book System Error, which was about tech and big tech and how we can do things differently. And I don't know if it was intentional, but I watched a show that is relevant to this book, and I wanted to talk about it. And before I begin, there could be some spoilers. I'll try not to do that. I think it's a really good show, Severance, on Apple TV. So I will talk about it. If you haven't seen it and you want to see it, it's up to you. I'll try to be careful not to spoil too much. I'll really talking more about the premise, not getting into the details of the show. So the premise of the show, which I found interesting, although have some issues about the execution of it, which I'll explain. So people essentially, that Severance, the reason the title of the show is that there's people that can voluntarily choose to completely separate their experience of their home life and their work life. So what that means is that when they go to work, when they're in the elevator, they've already had a chip implanted into their brain, so that when they are in the elevator, they switch the chip, so now they switch to their work experience, which means they don't remember anything from their life in general or who they are. And then similarly, when they switch back to their home life or who they are outside of work, they don't remember work at all. They don't even know being there. They have no memory of it at all, of that experience of being at work. It's just completely split off in that way. So it's severed. And so you might wonder, why would anyone want to do this? One of the main characters of the show, early on we learned that he recently lost his wife. His wife has died, and so it's a way for him to essentially shut off his brain for 8 hours a day. So he's not thinking about it, which itself is interesting. That's something we often try to do. We try to avoid the pain, but really that doesn't lead to healing. It just might make us feel we're bearing the pain a little bit better, but actually we tend to do better when we face the pain and go through it. So as I was saying, the premise itself, as is often the case with sci-fi types of shows or movies, you have some basis in science, and then some of it might deviate a bit. Sometimes it's something that doesn't exist yet in science. But here the issue I have is that when we look at separating our experience in this way, if there was this chip that could switch the memories you have access to, so much of what we experience, or our brain, is unconscious, or we're not aware of it. So that's what I was trying to understand, how that would make sense or how that would work. So much of what we do day to day, or what the brain does, is unconscious. How do you figure that out in this sense, that if you experience something at home, or if you learned something at work, let's say even procedurally, or it affected you in some way, would it completely be gone? And we see some instances where maybe there is some bleeding happening there. I actually read an article by or that interviewed the neuroscientist or neurosurgeon they consulted for years before they created the show, and then actually it wasn't planned, but when they had to do a scene of showing how they implant the chips, the neurosurgeon himself did some acting for the first time by playing that character. Of course, not much of a stretch as a neurosurgeon, but it also showed that they wanted to be more accurate, so it was good to have an actual neurosurgeon performing that part or showing how that would be done. But anyway, but I was surprised that he said this technology might not be so far away. We're understanding things about the brain and how memory works, but for me it's still kind of puzzling to think of how can we actually separate so much, because so much of what we have in our brain is something that is unconscious. So even if you can't make conscious memories or those don't stick, how does that exactly work? But the premise to me is still very interesting. When you see the show, I think they did a great job of creating this world that you escape into. But I hope you will check out the show if you haven't already, and nothing I've said I think would mess up your experience of that. But just this mindset that we try to switch off our experience. I don't think anyone listening has a chip in their brain to do that, but we find ourselves doing it in so many ways to avoid experiencing our life in some ways. And so avoidance is not all of our defense mechanisms can have some value at some times. Let's say, for example, you're waiting to get a medical test back, and there's nothing you can do in that time. If you can distract or avoid thinking about it, that's good. There's no need for you to keep thinking about, what if it's this, what if it's that, what if it's this, what if it's that. You might need a few thoughts to collect about what would I do in these two cases, but even that you don't want to go too far because you don't know what you need to do. But sometimes there's some preparations you might have to make, but in general you have to just wait. Or you apply to some school, or you're waiting for some academic test results. In those cases, actually, distraction or avoidance are good. You don't get anything from thinking about the problem. And even in general, sometimes when we have an issue we can do something about, it can be important to be able to shut off thinking about it at times and doing something else and coming back to it. So there is some benefit to it, and sometimes it can make sense to avoid or not feel something or think about something. So this idea of being able to actually sever your experience. The problem is that we, as we do with essentially any defense mechanism, use it too much, overuse it, and don't recognize how it's harming us. And so we avoid in a lot of ways, and technology is one of those big ways that we avoid it. Or even watching shows, like I was saying, if you watch this show, we often can overdo that. It can be okay for a little bit, but we avoid experiencing what we're going through. And so I see this as a therapist on a daily basis, where people come into therapy to talk about what they're going through, and even in therapy they can be avoiding talking about the things that are really difficult. People have this mindset that, well, if it's about going to therapy to work on your issues, why wouldn't someone say everything? But it's easier said than done. One, you can feel uncomfortable just sharing with anyone, even if it is a therapist. Of course, hopefully your therapist makes you feel comfortable, but even that could be an issue. You might not feel comfortable with them. People also don't want to face things themselves. So it's not just about sharing it with someone else. We are often in denial and don't want to accept or face our own realities because they can make us feel a certain way. So we avoid thinking about it, or we don't want to think about that. A similar thing could be said, someone goes to school and they don't try their best. And you say, well, you're going to school or you're paying for it, wouldn't you try your best? But people always don't, and no one really is probably trying 100% their best. Those things, it's easier said than done to just say, well, you're going there to learn, you should be totally working your hardest. Or if you're going to therapy, you should be 100% open. But as a therapist, I see that people have different degrees of how open they are to their own experience. And not only that, I see how much in their day-to-day, as they express what they go through, they avoid their own experience, so they don't get in touch with what they are going through or what's happening to them day to day. Because of that discomfort, we usually should expect that if you're avoiding a feeling, it's not because it feels really good, it's because it doesn't feel good. It's not pleasant, so you don't want to feel it. This is also why people tend to avoid meditation. People will say things like they don't have time. Almost always time is an excuse we make for something we're avoiding for some other reason, or they'll say they do it but they get bored. And boredom is a word that we use kind of like laziness but in a different way, but it usually means anxiety more than it means we're actually bored and not enjoying something. So I hear people say this about their social anxiety. Before they realize it's social anxiety, they say, I really don't have a good time at parties. And then when we look a little bit closer, for some people, it's not that they don't like parties or they'd rather be home. They'd like to enjoy the party, but they get nervous. They don't know what to do, who to talk to. They get uncomfortable. So in that moment when it's feeling nervous or being home and comfortable, they prefer being at home. But actually what they really want, if they looked closer, is they'd like to be able to be at the party and have a good time and interact and enjoy the company. But because that's hard for them, they choose being home. So it's not that they're bored, they're anxious. And the same thing happens when people meditate and say they get bored. It's usually not that they're bored, it's that they get uncomfortable facing their feelings, so they want to go away from it. And one of the things that people have to overcome, or one of the myths we have about meditation, because we think of it as this type of Zen, relaxed, enlightened kind of a thing, we imagine that if we meditate, we're just going to feel good. When actually, the reality is that if you meditate, you're going to get in touch with your feelings and your thoughts, which are not all good. There's going to be ones that are not pleasant. Things you wish you weren't thinking about or caring about. Feelings you wish you didn't have, and also feelings that don't feel good to have, that can be uncomfortable or painful. But if we want to have a more connected experience with ourselves, we have to open ourselves to all of the things. We can't just say, I only want to feel good and I want to be connected to myself. You have to be open to feeling those things. So people avoid feeling it because it might not feel good, and because of that they avoid that. So meditation is one of the things that people avoid, but in general, just being in touch with our feelings, even being in touch with the people around us. We'd rather they don't tell us how they're feeling, because then we're going to have to feel our own feelings about it or get into that, and people avoid things. So I see avoidance as one of the biggest, if not biggest, defense mechanisms that we use as human beings, and we're always looking for ways to avoid things. And so when technologies come along that facilitate avoiding, they become very popular. They do very well. So going back to what I was saying in the first segment, looking at, is a technology good? We can't just look at if it's efficient or if it makes money. We want to look at the human impact. We do want to see how these types of technologies are affecting us by making it easier for us to avoid. So we can't blame them for the avoiding we do, or we can't say we cannot, we could still avoid it if we wanted to, but we have to recognize that we have to be aware of what we're putting out there and how it's going to affect individuals, that we are aware of that. And as individuals, we want to be aware of that too. So one thing I highly recommend, in this book, they mention something about this too. It goes back to this black and white type of mindset, to completely avoid social media. So some people say, close all your social media accounts or delete them. And that can work. And if you want to do that, great. I wouldn't encourage you to get on there if you're not. But for many people, this won't be realistic. And what could be important is to limit or be mindful of how much you're using your phone and social media. So don't go cold turkey, because you probably won't do it for long and it won't last. But see if you can limit how much you're on there. Those things have an impact too. Because one of the things that social media does is they try to just capture your attention and make you forget you're even on there. They want you to zone out, which is what all of us have likely experienced at some point, that you're looking on things, and it's not just about you have a feed, you also have Discover and other places, and things just keep coming at you, right? There's almost like this, it's not that you search for something, you can, but things are just thrown at you now based on the algorithm of what you seem to be interested in and enjoy, and now you just watch little videos or short clips or pictures, and they come at you nonstop. And most people have had this experience that they think they're just going to go on and check for a minute, and then they're on for 30 minutes, an hour, and don't realize how the time is gone. So setting limits on your social media and device use, to me, is something very important to think about. Don't necessarily make it black or white. People, they go through these periods and they put a post, going to step away for a while, I'm not going to be on here for a little while, and that's okay. Those can be good too for some people. But if we look at more of a long-term type of a solution, or type of a result for ourselves, I think it's much better to consider how you can limit those types of things, whether you create certain windows where you don't at all look at your phone or look at social media, or after a certain time you don't, which can have multiple benefits. One is helping you get to sleep earlier. Looking at screens can be bad for us as far as the blue light and things they emit, which can affect your circadian rhythm, which allows how you prepare to sleep, your brain and your body get ready to sleep. Those are just some things to think about. But again, if you have seen the show Severance and you have any thoughts, I'd be happy to hear what you think about it. I thought it was quite fascinating. It's only been one season so far, and I'm sure I'll have to wait a year or so for the next season, but I thought it was a really interesting show. All right, let's go to a commercial break. Studio number 310-441-0555. We'll be right back. Welcome back. In this segment, I wanted to talk about power. Cue the Kanye song. Because of this book that I read on system error about big tech and things we see when power gets concentrated in a few hands, but try to understand again the nuanced ways I think we should approach looking at how power is distributed or what that even means and the issues that come up with power. So again, it's not a black and white thing that everyone shares every part of power equally, or that only a few people should have that. So for example, if you go on a plane, you don't want everyone to equally fly the plane or have equal opportunity to fly the plane. You want the person who has that expertise to fly the plane, the education, training, and experience of doing that. And so when we have situations in life, for example, we have to have people who have expertise or who have some level of proficiency do what they do. The issue with power that I see happening is throughout history and currently still, when you are in a position that gives you some level of either authority or some level of having some control, it comes with a certain status that usually means you get things for it. So you are the president, you get treated with a certain type of respect that other people don't. And some of that can exist, but we would be much better off if we recognize that when someone is given a position of power, it should be seen as a position of service, of serving other people. And to begin with, power does corrupt. We would like for it not to, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in that quote of absolute power corrupts absolutely. When we don't have any checks and balances on things, things become corrupt. We'd like to hope that it wouldn't be the case, but unfortunately that's what we see time and time again. So when people have any kind of power, it needs to be checked by others, by the systems, but also by themselves. So when we get power, we have to be very mindful of that, certain positions of power. One of the classic ones that comes to mind with this is a parent. So when you become a parent, you have, of course, a very unequal relationship with your child who is born completely helpless and dependent on you for even several years, much more than any other mammal. Our young are helpless, are altricial. They need our taking care of to even survive. So you have a very imbalanced system there where the parents take care of the kids. So that's also imbalanced, that they give a lot more than they get. But of course they have a lot of power in this relationship. And so what I've seen and what I advise parents to do is you have to be mindful not to become a dictator, which I know sounds silly, or it sounds like, well, of course not, but it's a lot easier said than done, because you are prone to go into that when you have this ability to have so much impact and influence with really no checks. We have certain checks from like a government standpoint of Department of Child and Family Services when things become abusive and things get to that point, but in general, parents are given this type of, it's a type of dynamic where they have a lot of freedom and there isn't a lot of checks. I see this, one time I was at, this is before the pandemic, I remember years ago, and it really hit me. I was really irked by the way this mother was talking to her child, and you could see that it was not that she was trying to help her child grow. She was trying to say, no, you can't do this, but you could just feel how much she was enjoying the power she had, that she was telling the child what he could or could not do and why, and explaining it in this way that made it seem like it had reasoning, but really it was just she wanted to have her way. And in that moment, I felt so much this injustice of how the parent has to be mindful of this. It's a position that is, I think, the most noble position we have in a relational sense, to be a parent, but we have to be mindful to not abuse that power that can come with it, that can come with having that type of station and situation. And so when you have a child, This is from Khalil Gibran. You don't own your child, you owe your child. So it's not that the child is your possession, but that actually you are to serve your child as the parent. You've been given this position, you have this, and of course, as a parent, you've created it yourself, you've even created your child, but now you are the one that is serving the child. You owe them, not you own them. But it's very easy to fall into that because you do make the rules. When you're the one that makes the rules and controls what happens and doesn't happen, it of course can feel like you have some kind of power or status that should feel good. But when we recognize the power is in service of some other good, that's when it can have a beneficial impact. So it goes back to even how I look at success as not about what you get, but what you give. So you have a position of power so you can give more, you can help more, you can take care of in a better way. The teacher has the power over the classroom to serve the interests of all the children. And this can be difficult when there's many children, different needs, different things going on, but they're using that power for the benefit of the children, not because it feels good, not because they want to have a power trip and feel good about themselves. And again, this is something that we naturally go towards. When we have power and we don't have certain consequences, we tend to abuse that power in some way. So a parent is given this great responsibility and does have that great power, but it should be seen as, how can I serve my child by being a parent? And so when I say this, it doesn't mean you are a servant in the sense that you let people walk all over you, or even let your kids walk all over you, and there doesn't have to be respect. You can't see yourself as a servant in the sense that you're serving, but not in the sense that you now debase yourself or put yourself below. And some parents do that. They think, well, because I don't want to have this power over them, or because my children are the ones who should have the power, they completely neglect themselves, or they don't actually assert themselves enough in the service of their child. If you don't have any rules in your home, and you think that's because I don't want to be a dictator or a tyrant, so I have no rules, that's not going to help your child. They need to feel there is some strong sense of stability and base in their home. They do need to learn certain things and consequences about life and experiences that will happen in order for them to grow. So, as I was saying, I prefer the nuance. It's not to go the other way, that you should completely have no power or say or make everything equal and democratic from the first moment. It's not going to work. You as a parent have to take some level of assertiveness of taking on that role. But you have to be so mindful not to go the other way. It's just natural. Who's going to make the bedtime? You get to make the bedtime or decide what your child eats or doesn't eat. And if you're not mindful of it, you will likely take on that power, especially if you are feeling smaller or not as good in other aspects of your life. So when you go to work and you feel like your boss is picking on you or being unfair towards you, you're much more likely to go home and do that with your kids, because now you feel like this is where I have the power. So this is where we see the systems affect one another. But when we look at power as a thing you use and abuse and use to your benefit, we recognize how it can become harmful. But we recognize that power and authority is used to helping others. How can I serve others? We have a very different perspective on it. We can look at the same thing as, for example, a medical doctor who get a certain status or prestige for being that role or having that profession, some of which we can understand. Sometimes it probably will go too far, especially in certain cultures, including our own. But nonetheless, it is something that can be very good. But when a doctor goes to school, we could see two different paths. And this goes to when I had Payam Banifaz on the show. Monday, we talked about this. For example, a singer could go to become a singer because they want money and fame and all the things that come with it for them, what they get, or they could want to share their gift with other people of music that might connect them, might make them feel things, might bring them together, or make them feel joy, whatever it might be. That's something they want to give. Someone could go to medical school because they want to get money, they want to get prestige. In our culture, you can go to, in Iranian culture, you go to medical school and become a doctor. Now you know you have certain things that come with that, and so you might go for those reasons, the approval, the validation, the compensation, and the status that you get. And it's hard to say we're not going to care about those things. I understand that. However, if you can recognize, I'm going to learn to actually empower myself to help other people, to me, this would be the mindset we would want to strive more towards. I want to learn about this treatment because I might save someone's life or reduce their pain and their suffering, to give that to them. That's a very different mindset than I'm going to go get this degree and then everyone's going to look at me a certain way and I get certain things. And I recognize that that's always going to be there. Even the singer that says they want to share their gift, it's not that they don't like the fame and the money and things that might come with it. We don't want to fool ourselves in that way to think that that's the goal or that's what we're trying to achieve, is some level of not caring about those things. Of course we're going to care about those things and they can be there. You'll even feel good when you have those parts. But what is the thing that is driving you? What's the intention of what you are doing, or the more overwhelming attention? Just like when you do something nice for someone, I know people say you shouldn't care at all about how they react, but of course you're going to. You want to make that not the reason you do it. If you're giving them something just because they're going to like you or give you something back, that's very different from you do something out of kindness because you want to do something for them, and when they respond kindly and appreciatively, it feels good. It shouldn't be that, no, it shouldn't feel good when they say thank you and have a nice smile on their face. Of course that's going to feel good. To me, actually, we can almost look at those as separate things. Your intention is one thing, and you have a feeling about that I think this is the right thing to do this kind thing. And then you also have a feeling about how they respond, whatever that might be. If they didn't respond kindly, or if they rejected it, or they made you feel like they didn't care about what you did, of course you'll have a feeling about that. And now you'll process that and see, is that going to impact what you do in the future? If you genuinely think what you did was still kind and the right thing to do, hopefully you'll keep doing it, even though you have a feeling about how they responded. So I know sometimes people say, well, if you got upset about what they did, or if you kept track of it or knew, it means it wasn't out of kindness. I don't actually agree with that. I think it's more complicated. Of course you're going to care about how someone responds. I hear this about, for example, serving food to people and they might not respond in a certain way. Let's say giving food to someone who is homeless and, they rejected the food and that's why I shouldn't do it. It's like, well, if you think what you did was right, of course you're going to have a feeling that they rejected the food, but hopefully it won't discourage you from helping others if you think it's the right thing to do. So when you come back to positions of power or status or things that people have, it's understandable that it's going to have an impact on how we see people, how people get treated. We can sometimes give them some kind of treatment that's different. I always have issue with how much we give people when they have positions of power. And we see this throughout history, and I think it's becoming less, where certain people had power and prestige and status, and because of that, they were treated well, whereas most other people were not. They were not given that type of a power or some type of even privileges, of basic privileges of life, and that is not okay. And I think we're moving more away from that. I think it's related to even things like the concentrations of wealth, which of course is very much linked to power and the things and possibilities that we have, that we do better as a society when it's more egalitarian. And even when you mention that, people go into this, well, you're saying everyone has exactly the same power and exactly the same everything? No. But we want to move away from the extremes of these things, extremes of the wealth and poverty, extremes of power, where some people have power and some people don't. And when we think of a democracy, when we have that ideal includes that we share the power in that way. Everyone gets a vote. And this is something we've moved towards, even in the United States. So first, white men, not even just white men, white land-owning men could vote. And slowly it's changed to include all people over time, men, women, and then of different races. We've had to make progress to go towards that ideal that we recognize is the way to go, which I think we still have a ways to go as far as balancing power. But when we have things concentrated in certain individuals and only in those individuals, we have issue. And again, I hope we can move away and recognize that the benefit of having people have certain power or authority is that they do it in the service of others rather than what they get out of it. We affect also who wants those positions, because if you get a position of power that makes you then get everything and you can treat people poorly and all that, well, the wrong people go towards it. But if you create positions of influence or positions where you can make an impact, where people are held to a standard of helping others rather than what they get, it's going to draw other people as well. These things are very complicated. I understand it could be simplified in how I'm bringing it up. My intention here is to consider the mindset when we look at society at large, but then also looking at your own life, recognizing that, yes, it feels good to have power. Power comes control. When you have control, you feel better, that you can predict the outcome, you can predict what's going to happen, you can make sure what you want happens in a variety of ways, from getting the needs that you have met, also your preferences and all those types of things. So it's understandable, but being aware that we are very much going to, very easy to be abusing that power. No matter who you think you are, that you think I'm not a power-hungry person, I'm not someone who cares about these things, we all get impacted and influenced when we get some power. We see it happen. And we have to try to keep ourselves in check. I think as a society, we should keep those checks and balances, but as an individual, we have to reflect on that. Think about even a scenario you walk into where you have the upper hand. How are you going to use that? Is it going to be to take advantage and to get what you want, or is it in the service of others and taking care of them? Valuing and cherishing that position that you have to help rather than to get and to take. All right, let's go to a commercial break. Studio number 310-441-0555. We'll be right back.